When strange patterns of fear began spreading across nations, Miss Marple quietly traced them back to the moment the nuclear age was born. This journey also explores how nations raced for dominance, how fear spread faster than science, and how misunderstandings fueled a global panic. From political rivalries to secret agreements and the ethics of destructive power, Miss Marple unravels the hidden forces that shaped the nuclear age. Welcome to the series of Driftway Tales. I am your host Ilias. If you are true lovers of these videos about scientific mysteries, then please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 1: The Letter That Should Not Exist. The morning the world changed, Miss Marple did not notice it at first. She simply opened her cottage window to let in the cool air of St. Mary Mead air that normally carried nothing more dramatic than the scent of roses and the distant hum of a milk cart. But today, the air carried something else, a distant tremor, a vibration that didn't belong to the English countryside. A low, a natural hum like metal remembering heat. She felt it through the windowsill, a tiny quiver against her fingertips. Moments later, the village postman bicycled up the lane far faster than the hour required. "Special delivery, Miss Marple," he called, breathless. "All the way from America. If you can believe it, America." Miss Marple wiped her hands, straightened her hat, and accepted the envelope. It was thick, heavy, stamped with a seal. She did not recognize something official, something that did not want to be understood. She opened it carefully. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, burned slightly on one corner. "Dear Miss Marple, you once said wisdom is not loud, but accurate. We need that accuracy now. There's been an event. A brilliant light in a desert no man was meant to see. I fear something terrible has begun. Dr. Abigail Stone, Los Alamos Laboratory, New Mexico." Miss Marple read the lines 3 times. She had never heard of Los Alamos. She had never heard of Dr. Abigail Stone. But she recognized one thing immediately. This letter was written by someone who had just watched humanity open a door it could not close. Miss Marple left that very evening. The steamship crossing from Southampton to New York felt different from her earlier travels. The newspapers whispered of a new scientific horizon, of weapons beyond imagination, of races between nations, but no one knew details. Everything was coded, everything was half said. And yet, Miss Marple noticed the signs. A nervous physicist scribbling equations on napkins at dinner, a general staring too long at the horizon, a diplomat sweating whenever someone mentioned uranium. By the time she reached New York, a polite man in a grey suit was waiting for her at the dock. "Miss Jane Marple?" he asked quietly. She nodded. He handed her a sealed railway ticket. "Your presence has been requested farther west." "How far west?" she asked. "Farther than most go," he replied. "The desert, New Mexico." And with a stiff nod, he vanished into the crowd. Miss Marple, undeterred, boarded the train. She had solved murders, feuds, lies, and tragedies, but this was different. This felt larger than any village, any crime, any secret feud. This felt like humanity fumbling with something too bright to hold. As the train roared across the American plains, the land grew emptier, flatter, hotter. And then she saw it, a column of dust rising in the distance, a military checkpoint, a scientist pacing with a clipboard, a truck carrying lead-lined boxes. Miss Marple stepped off the train into a world no one would ever sleep peacefully in again, not fully. Dr. Abigail Stone met her at the gate. She was thin, pale, brilliant eyes sunken from nights of sleepless calculations, hands shaking with the residue of fear. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "I didn't know who else to trust." Miss Marple touched her arm gently. "Tell me from the beginning, my dear." Dr. Stone took a breath. "We have built something," she said. "A device that splits the heart of matter. A machine that releases the energy locked inside atoms." Miss Marple stayed calm, listening with the patience of 1,000 village investigations. "We tested it last week," Dr. Stone continued, "in the desert, before dawn." She hesitated. "What happened?" Miss Marple asked. "The sky turned white," Dr. Stone whispered, "not daylight white. A flash that swallowed darkness, then a wave of heat. A thunder that arrived too late to warn us." She tightened her grip on Miss Marple's arm. "We created a sun," she whispered, "a small sun, one that kills." Miss Marple frowned gently, not in fear, but in thought. "And what troubles you most?" Dr. Stone exhaled shakily. "It wasn't just the weapon. It was what happened afterward. The generals cheered, politicians demanded more. Other nations already know, they want their own." Miss Marple felt a chill not from the desert wind, but from the clarity of human nature. "Fear has begun to travel," she said softly. "Faster than science." Dr. Stone nodded. "Exactly. The laboratory compound was a strange mix of brilliance and dread." Miss Marple noticed everything. Men in white coats arguing over chalkboards. Soldiers inspecting crates marked danger. Radioactive. Scientists whispering about chain reactions, fission yields, plutonium cores. But one thing troubled her most. Everyone seemed terrified for a different reason. Some feared the weapon. Some feared rival nations. Some feared being blamed. Some feared being ignored. A young physicist named Henry Caldwell rushed to her in panic. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you? The detective? You must help us." "With what, dear boy?" she asked calmly. "There's been a theft," he whispered. "A missing notebook, Dr. Stone's notebook." Miss Marple's heartbeat slowed. "What did it contain?" "The equations," he said. "The core mathematics. Enough to help any nation leap ahead." "And who would take such a thing?" she asked. Henry swallowed. "Someone who believes they're saving the world." "Or destroying it." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "A stolen notebook. Fear spreading. Nations watching. Secrets leaking. Human motives layered like unstable atoms." This was not merely a scientific race. It was a race of fear, pride, and misunderstanding. Miss Marple had seen such human patterns before in cottages, in villages, in quiet living rooms. But now those same small emotions had grown into global forces, and she alone, it seemed, had come to untangle them. That evening, Miss Marple walked alone into the desert. The cooling sand whispered beneath her shoes. The distant testing ground lay silent, holding the memory of an explosion that had burned itself into the sky. She knelt, picked up a handful of sand, and let it run through her fingers. "So this is the beginning," she whispered, "fire in human hands." Behind her, the night wind carried faint voices from the camp scientists arguing, soldiers shouting, papers rustling, secrets trembling. Miss Marple stood, the stolen notebook. Rival nations preparing, fear spreading faster than light. And somewhere in the middle, a truth waiting to be found before the world blinded itself with knowledge it could not carry. She tightened her shawl and walked back toward the lights of the laboratory. "A mystery," she murmured, "not of murder or jealousy, but of humanity itself." And so began the investigation that would draw her through politics, science, fear, ambition, and the fragile wisdom required when knowledge becomes fire. The nuclear age had begun, and Miss Marple, calm as ever, was ready to listen. Chapter 2. The Sparks Beneath History. The next morning broke with a strange clarity, the kind that feels less like weather and more like a warning. Miss Marple stood beside the large archival table in the London Institute of Modern Conflicts, her gloved hands resting lightly over the old folder Dr. Selene Park had placed before her. Golden light from the tall windows fell across yellowed documents stamped with dates that looked too recent to be history and too old to be forgotten. Miss Marple, Dr. Park said softly, these documents detail the moment the world entered the nuclear age. Every scientist believes they know the technical story. But the human story, the fear, the panic, the misinterpretations, that part remains inconsistent. Miss Marple nodded. And inconsistencies are where truths hide. She opened the folder. Inside were telegrams, half-burned letters, coded, memos, and the chilling photograph of a desert sunrise, except it wasn't the sun. It was the first nuclear test in 1945. The light in that photograph felt unnatural, like daylight forced upon the world without its consent. Her eyes narrowed. A light this bright never begins alone, she murmured. Something must have been burning long before it burst. Dr. Park leaned in. That's exactly what troubles me. What burned before the blast? Who started the fear that spread faster than the science? Miss Marple closed the folder gently. Then we must go backward, not to the explosion, but to the moment the first spark of panic was struck. And with that, the investigation truly began. Their first destination was the restricted map room deep beneath the institute. The room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. On the wall, illuminated under a single spotlight, was a sprawling map of the world covered in tiny red pins, each marking a moment of nuclear tension. But Miss Marple was drawn to something else entirely, a thin blue line connecting 3 cities, Berlin, Stockholm, and Washington, with dates scribbled below. The line didn't indicate movement of technology. It indicated movement of fear. Tell me, Dr. Park, Miss Marple said, what happened in Stockholm in 1938? Park blinked. That's when the scientific community first heard rumors of nuclear fission experiments. Most dismissed them, but a few panicked. Fear, Miss Marple said, is a faster courier than truth. She stepped closer and traced the line with a gloved finger. And what happened 2 months later in Washington? A confidential report warned that if Germany weaponized atomic science, the world would have no defense. Most of it was speculation. Speculation, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, is simply fear wearing a formal suit. Dr. Park swallowed. And Berlin. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. That is where fear grew legs. At that moment, Sir Roland entered, carrying a newspaper clipping from 1939. You'll want to see this, he said, placing it on the table. The headline read, "The race has begun. World powers scramble for a new kind of weapon." Miss Marple stared at it for a long moment. Then it was never about invention, she said quietly. It was about not being the last. A chill ran through the room. They moved next to the audio archive, a dark hall lined with steel drawers holding old recordings. A technician placed a reel on the player and nodded. This is a confidential communication from a physicist in Berlin to a colleague in New York, dated early 1939. It was intercepted by British intelligence. The reel hissed to life, and a trembling voice filled the room. We don't know if the reaction can be controlled, but if we don't pursue it, others will. Avoiding danger may be more dangerous than confronting it. Miss Marple frowned. That is not the voice of ambition. That is the voice of fear. The technician switched to another reel. This one from Washington. A few weeks later. We cannot risk being behind. Even a rumor is enough. Begin immediately. Dr. Park sighed heavily. So the nuclear age didn't begin with a discovery. It began with an assumption. Miss Marple shook her head. Worse. It began with the refusal to pause. A mind in panic makes decisions faster than a mind in reason. Sir Roland flipped through another file. Countries weren't racing for power, he said slowly. They were racing not to be powerless. Miss Marple looked at him. And that is when wisdom was forgotten. Outside, thunder rumbled though the sky was clear. An old building settling. Or perhaps history itself uneasy at being uncovered. That evening, Miss Marple and Dr. Park sat in the Institute Cafe, reviewing everything they had uncovered. The soft clatter of teacups around them contrasted sharply with the heaviness of their conversation. So far, Park said, we've learned that the nuclear age was born from miscommunication, fear of rivals, and political bravado. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. No age begins with one event. They begin as whispers, and only later become explosions. Park glanced around. Countries believed if they didn't run, they would fall behind. Miss Marple nodded. But when one is carrying fire, running is the last thing one should do. Park sighed. Then fear travelled faster than science. And louder, Miss Marple added, fear is the only sound that can drown out wisdom. A silence fell between them, not empty, but heavy. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. If we wish to understand how the world reached the brink, we must next investigate how secrecy spread. Secrets are fuel. And someone was carrying more fire than the rest. Park leaned in. You think one nation accelerated the race more than others? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think one man did. Park froze. Who? Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly. Then tomorrow, we go to the declassified human files. Her voice lowered, steady and chilling. Because behind every global panic, there is always a person who whispered first. That night, Miss Marple stood outside the Institute, the London wind brushing cool against her coat. The city hummed quietly, lights glowing, cars passing, life moving calmly unaware of the history she was unravelling. She looked up at the sky. The stars seemed faint, as if dimmed by the artificial light humanity had unleashed in the past century. She whispered to herself, knowledge is fire. Those who carry it must not run. And in that moment, she knew the truth. The nuclear age did not begin in a laboratory. It began in the human mind, the part that fears, compares, races, assumes, and forgets wisdom. Tomorrow, she would uncover the person who turned fear into a global flame. Tonight, she simply listened to the quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before the next truth is found. Chapter 3. The American Codes. A cold click echoed through the old research library as Miss Marple opened the steel drawer. Arnold's strategic correspond. Not crime scene evidence, not letters of scandal or betrayal, but something far more dangerous, misunderstandings preserved on paper. Inside were memos, telegrams, and anxious notes written in hurried American typewriter ink. At the top of the first page, a stamped line read, "Interpret with extreme caution, preliminary analysis only." Yet someone had made decisions based on these very drafts. Miss Marple ran her fingertips along a page describing a Soviet test that American intelligence suspected was imminent. The memo's tone was shaky, the phrasing uncertain. Nothing was confirmed, but fear turned theories into truths. Beside her, Dr. Avery pushed up his glasses nervously. These early American codes, he said, are why the arms race accelerated. Misread signals, assumptions, calculations built on shadows. Miss Marple nodded. Fear takes the shape of whatever room it is placed in, she said. In politics, it becomes urgency. In science, it becomes catastrophe. She noticed something else, small markings, initials, corrections, done by different hands, in different moods. Some scribbles were calm, some furious, some almost trembling. This, she whispered, is not just data. It is human panic, typed into existence. The next folder revealed something more startling. Internal disagreements. Scientists favored caution. Politicians favored speed. Military advisors favored readiness. Miss Marple compared signatures. One memo warned, "There is no proof Russia can produce a bomb before 1950. Another memo, written the same day, stated, "They may already possess one. Prepare immediately, same evidence." To opposing interpretations, one planetary consequence. How extraordinary, Miss Marple murmured. Not a battle of nations, but a war of misunderstandings. Dr. Avery handed her a decoded telegram from 1946, a short message from a Soviet laboratory interpreted as a weapons alert. The original Russian word meant preparation, but the American translator marked it as deployment. A single mistranslated word, a chain of strategic alarm. A new phase of the nuclear race. Miss Marple sighed softly. Instant merry mead. Misunderstandings lead to gossip. Here, they lead to doctrine. Avery looked ashamed. Our institutions didn't slow down to verify. They sped up to anticipate. Fear travels faster than truth, she replied. Faster than science, too. At the far end of the archive hall stood something strange, a locked cabinet with a brass plaque reading Special Collection, Confidential Interpretations. Dr. Avery hesitated. Inside are the documents that created America's long-term strategy. They're not weapons. They're interpretations about weapons. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Interpretations have started more wars than artillery. He unlocked the cabinet. Inside were charts projecting hypothetical Soviet capabilities. The charts were filled with question marks, dotted lines, shaded estimates. Nothing certain, everything urgent. Miss Marple studied them with the calm precision of a seamstress examining frayed stitches. These charts, she said, look scientific, but they are fear wearing the mask of mathematics. She picked up a briefing labeled Projected Soviet Bomb Count by 1955. The numbers were wildly speculative. Some predicted 4 bombs, others 200. And yet, Miss Marple said, policies were built upon these guesses. Yes, Avery admitted quietly. Because leaders thought waiting was more dangerous than acting. Miss Marple shook her head. Acting on fear is always more dangerous than waiting. She suddenly froze. A detail stood out. A small handwritten note along the margin. UK must align with US recommendations, even without proof. A directive, pressure disguised as alliance. She folded the document gently. People panic alone, she said. But nations panic together. In the corner of the room stood an old reel-to-reel recorder. Dr. Avery switched it on, and static filled the air, followed by voices from 1947. Unverified reports may indicate Soviet fabrication. Recommend acceleration of our program. Risk of falling behind. Miss Marple listened, eyes narrowed. These men are not plotting, she said. They are frightened of each other. Frightened of shadows. She moved closer. Unfrightened, she added quietly, of their own impatience. Dr. Avery nodded reluctantly. The Americans believed that if they slowed down, someone else would speed ahead. A self-created race. Miss Marple tapped her cane lightly on the floor. A race, she said, is only created the moment to runners believe they are racing. She returned to the papers. Her eyes moved between the lines, following the emotional trail: urgency, pride, rivalry, confusion, exhaustion. None of it malicious, all of it combustible. She whispered almost to herself, this was not the birth of war. It was the birth of fear pretending to be wisdom. By sunset, Miss Marple had reached the last folder: American-Soviet communications, attempts at reassurance. Inside was something heartbreaking: letters from American scientists asking for peaceful collaboration, and letters from Soviet scientists expressing the same hope. Yet none of these messages ever reached the decision-makers intact. Edits, removals, filtered translations. Miss Marple closed the folder gently. So the world entered the nuclear age, she said softly, not because people wanted war, but because peace was mistranslated. Dr. Avery looked exhausted. Miss Marple, what do you think all this means? She smiled, calm, wise, unshakable. It means, she said, we shall discover next why the panic spread faster than the facts. She stood, cane tapping softly against the polished floor. And it means, she added, that fear has a second birthplace. If America misunderstood Russia, then Russia must have misunderstood America as well. Dr. Avery froze. You mean we must now look at? Yes, Miss Marple said. The Soviet archives. She paused at the door, her silhouette framed by the cold hallway light. The nuclear age was not built by scientists, she said, but by frightened minds rushing through fog. And with that, she stepped into the corridor, ready for the next layer of the truth. Chapter 4: The Secret That Sparked the Race. Miss Marple arrived at the quiet university archive just after sunrise. The corridors were cold, the air still, as though the building itself held its breath. She had been invited by Dr. Amelia North, a physicist with sharp eyes and an even sharper sense of discomfort. Discomfort that rises only when someone discovers a truth that was never meant to be found again. This, Amelia whispered, placing a folder gently on the table, is what no one wants to acknowledge. The race for nuclear weapons began long before the public ever heard the word atomic. Miss Marple leaned forward. Inside were copied telegrams, old scientific memos, and the map showing 3 countries sending identical letters to their laboratories on the same day. Not collaboration, panic. Amelia pointed at the date. None of them actually had a bomb then, not even a working reactor. But they all believed the others did. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Fear travels faster than truth. A dangerous courier. And once the first telegram was sent, Amelia continued, the race began. Without a single explosion, Miss Marple touched the paper thoughtfully, her mind not racing, but arranging. When one child believes another has a bigger stick, she said softly, they both end up carrying stones. A sudden knock interrupted them. A young researcher, Oliver Reeves, stepped in, his face pale with urgency. They sent a notice, he said, waving a letter. The government is demanding access to these archives. They think someone leaked them. Amelia's face tightened. But we didn't leak anything. Miss Marple looked at Oliver. My dear, governments rarely chase the truth. They chase the fear of losing control of the truth. Oliver placed the letter down. It was stamped with urgency and caution, a combination Miss Marple recognized her well. The wording was polite, but the meaning was unmistakable. Hand over everything and stop looking. Miss Marple stood, her posture calm but decisive. This means you have found something real, something alive, something dangerous only because it is misunderstood. She asked Oliver for the full list of documents they had discovered. He handed her another folder, this one containing a timeline showing how each country believed they were falling behind, even though none had proof. What made them so certain? Miss Marple asked. Oliver swallowed. Rumors, misquotes, a misinterpreted scientific article, and a deliberate deception. Miss Marple raised her head slightly. Ah, a false signal. Yes, Amelia sighed. One country sent a fake message to create the illusion of progress. They assumed others would ignore it. Miss Marple shook her head gently. People don't ignore warnings. They obey their fears. They moved toward the underground archive chamber, Amelia unlocking metal doors as they descended. The hum of air vents echoed down the corridor. Miss Marple listened carefully, not to the machines, but to the echoes of human mistakes. At the end of the corridor lay a sealed cabinet labeled Early Atomic Correspondence, Restricted. Oliver unlocked it. Inside were thick folders, sealed envelopes, and one single box marked with red ink. Do not open -1938. Amelia frowned. We were never allowed to look at this one. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. My dear, that is why you must. Inside the box lay copies of newspapers with fear-heavy headlines, diplomatic memos implying breakthroughs that never existed, and one chilling document. If they believe we have it, they will rush to create their own. A strategy of panic, a plan designed to ignite a race. Amelia whispered, This is the spark. A single lie that made every nation accelerate. Oliver looked horrified. One lie. And millions of people paid the price. Miss Marple closed the box carefully. No, one fear. The lie merely gave it shape. Miss Marple asked for quiet. She stood in the dim light of the archive, her hand resting gently on the box. Let us think, she said. Not as historians, not as scientists, but as human beings watching other human beings panic. She laid out the documents in a timeline across the table. A speech misinterpreted, a newspaper exaggeration, a rumor repeated, a fake telegram, 3 governments reacting to fear rather than fact, scientists pressured to work faster because politicians whispered, we must beat them. It painted a picture more frightening than any weapon, a chain reaction of fear. What troubles me, Miss Marple said, is that none of these countries wanted a weapon first. They only wanted to avoid being last. Amelia breathed deeply. That means no one was leading the race. Everyone was running from an illusion. Miss Marple nodded gently. Exactly. And that is how fear wins, not by force, but by making everyone run faster than reason. Oliver ran a hand through his hair. So what now? If governments learn we uncovered this, they'll silence it. Miss Marple gave a small smile. My dear, truths like these do not need shouting. They simply need to be placed in the right hands. As they prepared the documents, the lights flickered, a sign someone else was now in the building. Amelia tensed. Oliver held his breath. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Miss Marple remained perfectly calm, her voice steady as water. Do not be alarmed. Whoever is coming does not know what we know. That is our advantage. The footsteps grew closer. Miss Marple spoke quietly, but decisively. Remember this, fear spreads through speed, but wisdom travels through stillness. Amelia whispered, What should we do with the documents? Miss Marple gestured toward the table. Tell the truth, but tell it gently. The truth that frightens becomes a weapon. The truth that reassures becomes a guide. The door slowly opened. A man in a grey suit entered, expression tense, badge glinting under the lights. "We need to speak," he said. Miss Marple stepped forward before the others could react. "Of course," she said, with disarming calm. "We were expecting you." The man looked surprised and unprepared. Miss Marple smiled softly. "Now then, let us discuss what you believe is happening, and what is actually happening." The room fell silent, but Miss Marple had already decided something. This was no longer just a study of how the nuclear age began. This was a study of how fear governs nations, and she intended to unravel both. Chapter 5: The Race. No one admitted starting. The conference hotel looked like any other modern glass box, polished, polite, and pretending not to have a past. But as Miss Marple stepped into the lobby, she felt the thick, invisible weight of decisions once made here, handshakes, signatures, and the quiet approval of fear. Elena led the way, tablet in hand. This used to host early nuclear conferences in the late 1940s and 50s, she said. Back when the world was still pretending the bomb was an unfortunate exception, not the beginning of an age. They passed a wall of framed photographs, men in suits, flags behind them, smiles that didn't touch their eyes. Miss Marple paused at one. 3 delegates shaking hands, while 2 others in the background watched each other, not the camera. "That one?" Miss Marple asked. Elena nodded. London, 1948. Officially, talks on peaceful reconstruction. Unofficially, who else is trying to build what? Nobody wrote that part down, but you can see it. Miss Marple studied the faces. "Oh yes," she said quietly. "These are not men rebuilding. These are men calculating who will be late to the next weapon." They took the lift down to the basement level, where the real reason for their visit waited, a locked archive room labeled simply Technical Records, 1945 to 1965. "Here," Elena said, sliding in her card. "This is where the race stopped being secret and became paperwork." Inside, the room was cool, lined with metal shelves and grey boxes. No drama, no red stamps yelling top secret now. Only quiet folders, the aftertaste of panic turned into filing. Ray was already there, sleeves rolled, a stack of declassified memos spread out in front of him. "Perfect timing," he said. "We've reached the stage where everyone was lying to everyone, including themselves." He passed Miss Marple a thin folder. "This is the British side, just after the war." Publicly, the line was, "We will never again unleash such destruction unless forced." Privately, he tapped a paragraph with his finger. They were already planning their own bomb. Afraid of being left behind by the Americans, afraid of the Soviets, afraid of being small in a large weapon world. Miss Marple read the memo slowly. The language was dry, but the anxiety leaked through. "Necessary for prestige," she read aloud, symbolic of major power status. She looked up. So the first reason to follow was not protection. It was pride. Ray smiled soddily. Exactly. Everyone claimed security, but in these papers, they were terrified of not looking important. Elena spread out another set of documents, this time from early Soviet intelligence. Same story. They called it strategic parity, but the tone is the same. We cannot let them have something we don't. And so, Miss Marple said, the race began. Not because anyone wanted to run, but because no one wanted to be seen standing still. Later, they sat in a small meeting room with fat glass windows, looking out over the city. The traffic below hummed like an insect nest. Planes scratched thin lines across the sky. Sir Roland joined them. dropping a slim leather folder on the table. "I brought you the diplomatic side," he said. "The respectable lies." Miss Marple smiled. "The kind written in good pen. Always," he said dryly. He opened the folder and pulled out a cable short, coded. "The kind diplomats send when they want to say more than they dare." "This," he said, "is from one of the early non-proliferation discussions. Officially, they wanted to prevent more countries from getting the bomb. Unofficially," he turned the paper toward Miss Marple. "Read the underlined sentence." She did. "We recognize the need to limit access to strategic knowledge, while preserving our own essential deterrent capability in perpetuity." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "In perpetuity? How convenient." "Exactly," Roland said. "They weren't building a safe world, they were building a club. And they wanted the door locked from the inside." Elena leaned forward. "So on one side we have scientists, originally driven by curiosity and fear of fascism. On the other, politicians driven by prestige and rivalry. Put them together and," Ray finished the thought, "you get an arms race that no one wants to own, but everyone fears losing." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And no one, I notice, is asking a very simple question." Ray looked at her. "Which one?" "How do you teach restraint?" she said. "In a vocabulary that only has words for victory." They moved on to the next phase of the history, the moment when the race spread beyond the first few. Elena laid out a map with years written over various countries, like a slow infection. "Here," she said, pointing. "The Americans first, then the Soviets, then Britain, then France, then others." Each entry justified using different language, but always the same logic. "We must, because they might." Miss Marple traced a finger along the dates. "No one says, 'We will stop,' so that they don't." "Never," Sir Roland said quietly. "Stopping would require trust. And trust was the one thing nobody had time to build." Ray unfolded another file. "Look at this one. It's a transcript from a ministerial meeting. Same year as a famous peace speech, actually. Listen to the phrases: window of vulnerability, gap in deterrent, credibility of retaliation." He looked up. "They talked about death like it was a currency." Miss Marple read the lines, lips pressing thin. "This is not language," she said. "It is camouflage. Behind it I see men who are frightened, but too proud to say so." Elena nodded slowly. "That's the pattern, isn't it? Country A tests a bomb. Country B panics. Country C panics about B's panic. And suddenly you have 3 bombs where there were none. Fear traveling faster than science," Miss Marple said. "The equations took years. The dread took weeks." She sat back, eyes thoughtful. "In my little village, when one person hears a noise in the dark, she imagines a burglar. She tells her neighbor. By the time it reaches the post office, there are 3 burglars, a ladder, and a stolen silver teapot. In reality, it is a cat on a loose shutter." Ray smiled, "And here the cat was." "The first bomb," Miss Marple said. "Terrible, yes. But alone, it might have remained a wound. It became a plague when people imagined all the burglars that might follow. As the afternoon faded, the city lights began to flicker on outside. The room felt smaller now, crowded with old phrases and newer understanding." Elena snapped a photo of the map, then put her phone down. "So what have we learned?" she asked softly. "If we had to tell this story in one line," Ray exhaled. "That science opened the door but fear invited everyone inside," Sir Roland considered. "That power was defined so badly, everyone chased it even while it terrified them." Miss Marple looked at the papers, The maps, the grey boxes. No, she said gently. We have learned something else. The others waited. We have learned, she continued, that no one ever voted for the arms race. Not the scientists in their labs, not the villagers under test skies, not even most of the men signing these memoranda. The race began in glances, in unspoken dread, in the inability to say, "We are afraid." She tapped the map with one finger. These was not votes, these were flinches. Elena shivered. Flinches, recorded as policy. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and that is what we must show your listeners. That the nuclear age did not simply arrive. It was built, piece by piece, by people who were too frightened to stay humble. She gathered one of the memos and placed it back in its box. Now, she said, rising slowly, we understand how the race began. Next we must see how it escaped its own designers, who taught others to run those not invited into the first club. Ray closed the folder. Proliferation, he said. The second wave, and, Miss Marple added quietly, the part where the fire left the fireplace. Chapter 6. The race no one admitted. The morning newspapers were a battlefield of headlines. Miss Marple sat in the small Washington reading room, pages spread before her like clues. Soviets expand atomic research. Britain accelerates nuclear program. United States announces new tests. Each nation claimed the others were rushing, provoking, responding. Miss Marple tilted her head. Curious, she murmured. Everyone insists they are last. Dr. Avery arrived with a stack of files and a face that held more truth than he intended to share. The race wasn't planned, he said. It happened. Races do not simply happen, Miss Marple replied gently. Someone starts running. He hesitated. Then perhaps no one wished to be seen as the first. Miss Marple picked up a report, her eyes narrowing at the dates. The American tests began days after Soviet announcements. The Soviets began days after British statements. The British began after whispers of German research resurfaced. A perfect circle of suspicion, a loop with no starting point. A race begun by fear rather than will. Dr. Avery, she said softly, you were describing something quite remarkable. A stampede with no leader. Later that afternoon, she met Lydia Reinhardt at a quiet museum cafe in Georgetown. Far from the roaring conversations of scientists and officials, Lydia spread her notes across the table, each page marked with arrows and dates. It's like a chain reaction, Lydia said. Every announcement triggers another. And what triggers the announcement? Miss Marple asked. Lydia pointed to a simple typed line. Unverified intelligence reports. No proof, Lydia added. Only whispers. Miss Marple leaned forward. So nations built weapons because of things they thought others might do. Exactly. Miss Marple exhaled a slow breath. Then the nuclear age began not with physics, but with panic. Lydia nodded. Fear travels faster than any particle. A rumor in Moscow can reach Washington before an atom splits. Miss Marple studied the notes again. But someone benefits from fear. Someone pushes it along. Lydia hesitated. Governments are too large, Miss Marple said. Fear's lightest footsteps are carried by individuals, frightened individuals. She tapped the dates again. Find the first frightened person, and you find the spark. They located him that evening. Not a scientist, not a general, but a translator. A young man named Jonah Reed, who worked in the basement floor of a government building, translating intercepted messages and foreign reports. He sat stiffly when they entered the narrow room with filing cabinets. Are you here to question me? He asked nervously. only to listen, Miss Marple said with a reassuring smile. You have been mentioned in several memos. Jonah swallowed hard. I made a mistake. Lydia leaned in. What kind of mistake? Jonah removed a stack of papers from a drawer, typed translations with sentences underlined in red. A single phrase appeared repeatedly. Immediate acceleration of weapons program. Miss Marple read them carefully. These are alarming, she said. But also vague. Jonah wrung his hands. I mistranslated them. The original text didn't say immediate acceleration, it said. Preparedness should not be delayed. I added urgency because you were afraid, Miss Marple finished softly. He nodded miserably. We all were. Berlin had fallen. Secrets were leaking. Everyone said the Soviets were on the verge of a breakthrough, I thought adding stronger wording would make our officials act faster, just in case. Miss Marple's face was gentle, but her voice carried the weight of truth. My dear boy, you never intended to start an arms race. Jonah's eyes filled. But I did. They read my translation. They panicked. Then the Soviets panicked, and so it began. Lydia whispered. A single phrase triggered the world's greatest fear. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on his arm. Fear is rarely logical, but it is always contagious. Miss Marple and Lydia walked out into the cool night air, the city lights trembling across the Potomac. The enormity of what they had uncovered moved between them like a silent shadow. Lydia finally spoke. It all started with a translation. A single frightened decision. Not quite, Miss Marple replied. The ground was already soaked in fear. He merely struck the match. She looked toward the Capitol dome glowing faintly under the stars. Politicians were afraid of being seen as weak. Scientists were afraid of being left behind. Military men were afraid of surprises. Lydia exhaled. And ordinary people were afraid of war returning. Miss Marple nodded. Fear built the first reactors. Fear conducted the first tests. Fear drafted the first treaties. The atom did not start the race. People did. They stood in silence as a siren echoed faintly across the city. A test siren, routine, yet chilling. Lydia whispered, No wonder the world feels tense. Miss Marple responded softly, Tension is merely fear wearing a uniform. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the observation tower overlooking the river. Fog curled across the water like pale smoke. She carried with her the photocopies Jonah had given them, the mistranslations, the corrections, the annotations. She laid them out on the railing and reread them. Each sentence, each tense change, each added urgency, tiny seeds that grew into a forest of global panic. Lydia joined her, carrying 2 cups of mild tea. What now? She asked. Miss Marple looked over the fog-covered city. We follow the fear, she said. Fear leaves footprints deeper than truth. And the next clue, Miss Marple folded the papers into her bag. Someone must have known these translations were exaggerated. Someone chose not to correct them. Lydia's eyes widened. You mean, the rush wasn't accidental? Miss Marple smiled sadly. My dear, nothing world-changing is ever entirely accidental. Below them, the fog began to lift, slow, hesitant, revealing the water beneath. Miss Marple watched it come. The nuclear age began with panic, she said. But it spread. That required intention. And with that, the investigation moved toward its darkest truth. Not how the nuclear age began, but who wanted it to run. Chapter 7: The Fear That Moved Faster Than Science. The next morning, Miss Marple rose before dawn, the sky still blue-black above Washington. She stood by the hotel window, listening to a city that had not yet realized how deeply fear ruled its heartbeat. Last night's conversation with Professor Holberg echoed in her mind. Science did not start the race, fear did. As the sun lifted, turning the Potomac a dull silver, Miss Marple walked briskly to the Library of Congress, where Holberg had arranged access to the old security files declassified only a month ago. Notably, every file was marked with a single red phrase, "Perceived threat." Inside the reading room, a clerk, young, sharp-eyed, nervous, placed 3 thick folders before her. "These documents," he said, "show how military decisions were formed. You'll see for yourself." Miss Marple opened the first folder. It contained transcripts of early communications between world powers, messages dripping with anxiety, urgency, and assumption. Every page had the same tone. One nation feared the other would strike first. She whispered to herself, "How simple it is for fear to pretend it is certainty." She read faster, absorbing the emotional temperature of history. Britain feared Germany. Germany feared the Soviet Union. The United States feared that everyone else feared something. This wasn't a race for power. It was a race to not be the last. Across the table, Professor Holberg joined her with a small notebook under his arm. "You see it now?" he asked. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "I see panic stitched into every page." People did not ask whether it was wise. They only asked whether it was possible. And once it was possible, the fear of receiving a nuclear blow grew far greater than the desire to avoid building one. Holberg nodded. "Exactly. Every nation convinced itself, if we do not build it today, our rival will build it tomorrow." Fear outran ethics. Miss Marple gently pressed her palm on a telegram dated 1943. The message said, "If enemy scientists are even 1 month ahead, we cannot afford restraint." She exhaled slowly. 1 month ahead. That is all it took for the world to abandon patience. Holberg leaned closer. "You asked yesterday how the nuclear age began. This is your answer. Nobody wanted to be first. Nobody wanted to be last. Everyone wanted to be safe. And ironically, they all became unsafe together." Miss Marple noticed another detail, a psychological one. The language of fear was contagious. Every message used escalating vocabulary: urgent, immediate, critical, threat, imminent danger, emergency capability. Language, she murmured, reshaped the world faster than the bombs did. For the first time in history, nations were united not by alliances, but by mutual mistrust. As afternoon light slanted across the polished tables, Miss Marple turned to the second folder, International Diplomatic Memos. Each memo revealed patterns, misunderstandings amplified into crises. An early British note: "We believe their silence implies dangerous preparation." A German note: "We fear Britain's secrecy indicates a new weapon under development." A Soviet note: "We must accelerate research." They are clearly ahead. Miss Marple placed her finger on the pages. No one was ahead, she said quietly. No one was certain. No one was calm enough to ask. Holberg sighed. Everyone interpreted silence as aggression. Not one nation said, "Perhaps they are afraid too." The more secret each project became, the more suspicious the others grew. Miss Marple stood and walked slowly to the large map displayed at the far wall, global borders marked with red and blue pins. She studied the lines. "This map," she said, "does not show geography. It shows anxiety." Oceans and mountains didn't matter anymore. Only assumptions did. Holberg joined her. Exactly. And that assumption triggered the nuclear arms race long before the first test. Science was merely catching up to fear. Miss Marple felt a heaviness settle in her chest, not fear, but clarity. Humans had created weapons of unprecedented destruction, because they were cruel, but because they were frightened. Evening fell. Washington's lights blinked alive, glowing like scattered embers across the horizon. Miss Marple walked with Holberg along the steps of the Capitol, the marble still warm beneath her shoes. "Tell me," she said, "what happened the moment the first nuclear test succeeded? What did the world feel?" Holberg hesitated. Relief followed by dread. Scientists cheered because the theory worked. Governments panicked because their rivals might succeed too. The moment silence broke into fire, diplomacy collapsed into suspicion. Miss Marple nodded. Discovery should lead to responsibility. But here, discovery led to speed. Holberg looked at her with a faint smile. "You understand better than any historian I've met." She chuckled softly. "Age teaches one to observe foolishness. Nations, like people, rarely think clearly when frightened." They paused before the memorial fountain, water rising and falling in rhythmic arcs. Miss Marple watched the motion. "Do you know," she said gently, "fear is the one emotion that spreads faster than truth. It leaps from one mind to the next, shaping whole governments." Holberg looked down thoughtfully. "Then the nuclear age did not begin with uranium, but with imagination." "Exactly," she replied. "With imagination running faster than wisdom." Back in her room, the city finally quiet, Miss Marple opened her notebook and began to write, summarizing her observations like a detective assembling clues. Fear is exponential. Assumptions become policies. Silence breeds suspicion. Suspicion breeds speed. Speed breeds danger. She paused, listening to the faint hum of traffic 5 stories below. The world had not changed since those early decades. Fear still traveled faster than science. She wrote her final line for the night. "Knowledge is fire. Those who carry it must not run." She closed the notebook firmly, as though sealing a chapter of human history inside it. For Miss Marple understood something most powerful nations had forgotten. No weapon was as dangerous as the pace at which fear moved. Tomorrow, she knew, she would have to investigate how that fear spread across continents, but tonight, for the sake of clarity, she allowed herself the peace of truth revealed. The nuclear age had not begun with a bomb. It had begun with a shiver. Chapter 8. The alliances forged in panic. Miss Marple had always believed that fear made people foolish, but now, as she walked through the vast marble corridors of the diplomatic building in Geneva, she realized fear also made nations behave like frightened children. The hall echoed with hurried footsteps, hushed arguments, and the soft rustle of sealed documents being passed from one trembling hand to another. She paused beside a window overlooking the lake. From outside, Switzerland looked peaceful, but inside these polished walls, whispers were sharp as blades. Lydia Reinhardt appeared at her side. Notebook pressed to her chest. "You were right," she said quietly. "They aren't negotiating cooperation. They're negotiating survival." "Fear will always pretend to be reason," Miss Marple replied. "It's an excellent actor." A diplomat hurried past them, his face flushed. Miss Marple caught a fragment of conversation. "If they build one, we must build 3. We cannot be left defenseless." The word clung to the air like smoke. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Lydia. "You see," she said, "the nuclear age did not accelerate because of knowledge. It accelerated because of panic." And with that, she led Lydia down the corridor, toward a meeting she had no invitation to attend, but every right to understand. Inside the private chamber, The atmosphere was thick with unspoken desperation. Representatives from 4 nations sat around a long wooden table. Maps and intelligence reports spread before them. Miss Marple and Lydia slipped silently into a corner where stacks of documents nearly reached the ceiling. At the head of the table sat Ambassador Keene, Sir Roland Keene's elder brother, a man known for strategy, not kindness. His voice was clipped, controlled, but the tremor beneath it betrayed urgency. "We cannot assume the others will act responsibly," Keene said. "A single miscalculation could shift the global order. We must prepare our response now." Another diplomat countered, "A response? You mean build weapons faster than our neighbors?" Keene's jaw tightened. "Do you propose we trust them?" Miss Marple observed each man carefully, the clenched fists, the tapping shoes, the darting eyes. These were not the faces of ambition. They were the faces of terror. A scientist at the far end of the table slammed a folder shut. "You all misunderstand the danger. The science is barely stable. One wrong calculation and—" Keene interrupted sharply. "We don't need explanations. We need advantages." Miss Marple leaned toward Lydia. "There," she whispered. "That is how fear travels faster than science." Lydia scribbled her words instantly. "Do you think they understand what they're pushing toward?" "Oh, they understand," Miss Marple said. "But they believe fear will protect them. They do not realize fear has never protected anyone." Just then, a sealed envelope slid across the table. Every diplomat stiffened. The document inside contained something that could derail peace entirely. When the envelope was opened, the room went silent. Even Miss Marple, from her quiet corner, felt the tremor ripple through the diplomats. Inside was an intelligence report, sparse but powerful. A rival nation was suspected of beginning uranium enrichment tests of their own. A single line in the report was underlined twice. "Unverified, but probable. Probable, not confirmed. Not proven." Just enough to ignite panic. Keene slammed his fist onto the table. "We have no choice. If they gain advancement, we will lose everything." The French diplomat protested. "It's speculation." Keene thundered. "Speculation is enough." Miss Marple stepped forward at last. She couldn't remain silent. "Gentlemen," she said softly, her voice polite yet unshakably firm, "speculation built on fear is the quickest route to catastrophe." The room froze. "Who let her in?" Keene snapped. "No one," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "But doors open easily in buildings where everyone is too busy panicking to check the locks." A few diplomats looked embarrassed. Another looked relieved. Miss Marple walked to the center of the room, each step calm. "The danger is not in what your rivals might do. The danger is in what fear is already making you do." Keene glared. "This is a matter of security." "It is a matter of judgment," Miss Marple replied. "And I assure you, judgment erodes long before security does." Lydia stepped up beside her. "If you rush toward weapons, your rivals will rush too. You are not racing to protect your nations. You are racing them into panic." Her words hit the room like a tremor. The silence that followed was different, not angry, but thoughtful, as though the diplomats were hearing an echo of a truth they'd long avoided. "But fear's grip is stubborn," a diplomat finally muttered. "We can't simply do nothing." Miss Marple rested a hand on the table. "Do nothing is never wise. But do everything quickly, that is worse." She pointed gently at the intelligence file. "Your entire strategy is based on one word, probable. You're preparing for war against shadows." Keene rubbed his temples. "We don't have the luxury of trusting shadows." Miss Marple's eyes softened. Then trust evidence, trust reasoning, trust calm minds. She tapped the table lightly. Fear is not a policy. Fear is a fog. Lydia added, and fog makes every rival seem larger than they are. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. You are building weapons not because science demands it, but because imagination terrifies you. Another diplomat whispered. Then what do we do? Miss Marple gave the simplest answer of her life. You wait. And you listen. Not passive waiting. Strategic waiting. Not weakness, wisdom. The diplomats reluctantly agreed to pause their immediate nuclear response. Not abandon it, but slow it. Reevaluate it. Recalculate. Not react. But Miss Marple knew the truth. This temporary pause was only a fragile bridge. Fear, once awakened, slept lightly. It could return with a whisper. As she and Lydia walked out of the chamber, Lydia asked, "Do you think we changed anything?" Miss Marple smiled subtly. "My dear, nothing changes quickly when fear is involved." She paused beside a window overlooking the calm lake. "But we can change how fear moves. Slow it just enough to allow reason to breathe." Lydia exhaled. National panic, secret alliances, competing research. It feels like the world is accelerating towards something terrible. Yes, Miss Marple said. But remember this, even history's darkest turns are shaped by human hands, and hands can learn restraint. Below them, a courier raced across the courtyard, carrying yet another sealed document. Miss Marple watched him with weary understanding. "The nuclear age," she said quietly, "will not be built by scientists. It will be built by frightened men racing one another toward a fire they barely understand." She looked at Lydia, eyes sharp with resolve. "And our task," she said, "is to learn why fear began running, and how to make it walk." They stepped into the sunlight together, knowing the story was far from over. Chapter 9. The Secret Language of Treaties. The conference room was too bright for the subject on the table. Long glass windows looked out over the river. Polished microphones waited like obedient insects. Nameplates sat in their neat row. United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, others. At the far end, nearly hidden behind a pillar, and a pot plant that seemed to have wandered in by mistake, sat Miss Marple. Her 1940s coat and small hat looked entirely out of time among the dark suits and crisp folders, but the badge on her lapel was quite modern. Observer, Civil Society. Someone from the Institute had slipped it to her with a smile. On the big wall screen, a presenter clicked through images: mushroom, clouds, missile silos, arrows across maps. The words were familiar now: arms race, deterrence, doctrine. But the faces in the room less confident than the language suggested. Nobody here, Miss Marple thought, truly trusted deterrence. They simply feared the alternative more. "And so we arrive at the first serious attempts at restraint," the presenter said. "Bilateral talks, hotlines, test bans." Miss Marple listened carefully. This chapter of the story, she knew, was not about explosions, but about sentences. Not about blasts, but about commas in treaties that might keep the world from having any more. When the session paused for coffee, she rose, smoothed her coat, and went hunting for fear in human form. It never hid very deep. In the corner, near the tall urn of indifferent coffee, stood Ambassador Keller, an American with tired eyes, and Ambassador Sokolov, his Russian counterpart, equally tired and a little more wary. They were speaking in low voices that had the rhythm of people who argued for a living and respected each other for surviving it. Miss Marple joined them with the air of a woman accidentally in the right place. "Forgive me," she said, "but you mentioned verification. I am very interested in how people learn to trust what they cannot see." Keller raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, that's the entire problem of arms control." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "You are both trying to prove you aren't doing something your government spent decades proudly proving they could do." A most awkward reversal. Sokolov's mouth twitched. "We used to show missiles in parades," he said. "Now we show inspectors around storage depots. Progress, then," Miss Marple replied. "From marching to measuring," Keller sighed. "Words on paper help. Test ban, hotline, no missiles in Cuba. That sort of thing. But words can be broken. The real change is when both sides are more frightened of accident than of each other." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "So the true negotiator at the table is not idealism, but anxiety." "Call it survival instinct," Sokolov said. "We discovered that miscalculation could kill us faster than an enemy's plan." Miss Marple filed us away. Fear, again, the same fuel that had built the arsenals, now being slowly turned, molecule by molecule, into caution. Later that afternoon, in a quieter side room with fewer flags and more bookshelves, a small working group gathered: historians, legal scholars, one former missile officer who now frowned more than he spoke. Miss Marple sat near the back, knitting nothing, hands folded. On the table lay copies of famous agreements: a hotline to connect rival capitals in crisis, a treaty limiting certain missiles, another banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere and oceans, draft language for a broader non-proliferation pact. "What unites them?" the chairperson asked. "Different decades, different leaders, same weapons." The former missile officer spoke at last. "We negotiated when we were scared enough," he said. "After close calls, Cuba, radar mistakes, false alarms. Each fright left a scar in the system, and someone finally said, 'Never again, if we can help it.'" Miss Marple thought of villagers in her quiet English stories who only stopped quarreling when the well's water turned bitter. People rarely change from wisdom alone. It is usually discomfort that does the teaching. A young lawyer pointed to one document. "This clause," she said, "about not stationing certain missiles in certain regions. It's not just geography. It's about time. How long it would take to launch. How much thinking space a leader would have." Miss Marple smiled. "So you are negotiating for minutes," she said. "Not just miles. Buying time for someone, somewhere, to reconsider." "Exactly," the lawyer replied. "Every added minute between fear and reaction is a life saved." Miss Marple looked out the window at the calm river. Treaties, she realized, were like extra bends in that water, slowing the current just enough to prevent it from becoming a flood. In the evening, she met Dr. Rana, a political psychologist, in the cafeteria downstairs. Trays, cutlery, plastic cups, the ordinary world carrying extraordinary conversations. "You've seen much of this history," Dr. Rana said. "From fission's first light to cities under the shadow of missiles." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Enough to know that numbers of warheads matter, certainly, but so do numbers of meetings." Rana nodded. "That's the part people don't see in documentaries. Endless rooms, stale air, people arguing over verbs. Verbs win wars and prevent them," Miss Marple said. "Shall destroy, will refrain. One syllable between catastrophe and restraint." Dr. Rana smiled. "You understand better than some diplomats." "We also found something curious. Once talks began, it became harder for leaders to dehumanize the other side. Having a phone number for your rival's office, makes it slightly more difficult to imagine them as a cartoon villain. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "so you discovered what any village does in a smaller way. That a shared teacup can do as much as a locked door." Rana leaned forward, and then came the next step, multilateral treaties. Not just to rivals, but many states agreeing to hold themselves back, promising not to build, not to sell, not to spread. "And did everyone obey?" Miss Marple asked. "Not everyone," Rana said, "but enough, a net, not a wall. It catches many, misses some, but it's better than letting everyone run in the dark." Miss Marple thought of her line about fire, knowledge as flame, treaties as buckets of water placed along a very flammable road. That night, alone in her modest guest room, Miss Marple spread papers across the bed, as if laying out clues from a village murder. Only this time the victim was hypothetical, and the suspect was human folly itself. On one side, she wrote, "WHY nuclear arms spread, fear of rivals, prestige, misunderstanding, national pride, domestic politics." On the other side, "Why they have not yet ended US accidents, revealed, near misses confessed, treaties signed, hotlines installed, inspectors allowed, citizens protesting, scientists warning, leaders occasionally listening." Between the two lists, she drew a thin pencil line. "Diplomacy," she wrote above it, "the art of teaching fear better manners." Outside, the city lights reflected faintly on the river, and somewhere in the building a vacuum cleaner hummed, a small, practical sound in a place that discussed global annihilation by day. Miss Marple leaned back against the pillows and closed her eyes. Behind them, she could almost see the story now as a single picture. Early laboratories glowing with curiosity, wartime bunkers glowing with fear, missile fields glowing with power, and now conference rooms glowing with screens full of graphs and percentages, where people argued not about how to win a nuclear war, but how to make sure there was never one to win. It was not a happy story, but it was not entirely hopeless either. It was, like many human tales, a long negotiation between our worst impulses and our late arriving wisdom. In her notebook, before sleep, she wrote a line for a future conclusion. "Treaties are imperfect locks on a dangerous door, but every honest lock, every extra minute of doubt, is a small vote cast by humanity against its own destruction." Then she closed the book, turned off the lamp, and let the quiet of the night do its work, knowing that even while she slept, somewhere, someone was adjusting a comma in a document that might, one day, save a city. Chapter 10. The Race That No One Won. The morning after the coded telegram controversy broke, the world felt as if it were holding its breath. Miss Marple stood on the veranda of the small research house overlooking the fog-covered coastline. The din of teletype machines, radio commentary, and frantic government messengers echoed from inside. None of this chaos surprised her. Fear had become visible, loud, uncoordinated, panicked. And fear, she knew, spreads faster than any scientific discovery ever could. Lydia came rushing out with a stack of reports. 3 nations now claim the others are hiding accelerated nuclear experiments. None of them trusts the other. Everyone believes everyone else is lying. Miss Marple took the papers, scanning calmly. "What did I tell you, my dear?" she said gently. "Fear travels faster than science. Scientists discover atoms in years. Politicians misunderstand them in seconds." Suddenly, the radio in the conference room crackled. A new broadcast from Washington, then one from Moscow, then London, each insisting they were forced to advance nuclear research because others had begun first. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. No one started it, she whispered. They only believed someone else had. Inside the meeting room, tension sat like a weight. Maps were spread across tables, circles drawn around laboratories, naval bases, desert testing fields. Dr. Selene Park pointed to a list. Every nation is preparing something because they think the others already have it. It's a chain reaction of paranoia. Humanity's first uncontrolled reaction, Miss Marple said quietly. Sir Roland shook his head. We've interviewed physicists. They say none of these weapons exist yet, only theories, only sketches, and sketches, Miss Marple reminded him, are the most dangerous of all. Sketches are empty enough for imagination to fill with fear. The room fell silent. Then Lydia spoke. Miss Marple, how does this chain even begin? Someone must have sparked it. Miss Marple placed her hand softly on the table. It began with ambition, followed by rivalry, followed by one rumor. She turned to the chalkboard and wrote 3 words. Fear gives assumption, gives action. This, she said, tapping the chalk, is the formula that built the modern nuclear age. Not uranium, not reactors, not equations. Sir Roland exhaled slowly. So you're saying the nuclear age wasn't born from knowledge? Miss Marple shook her head. It was born from misunderstanding. Just then, a young researcher burst into the room, pale, breathless, trembling slightly. You need to see this, he said, handing Miss Marple a sealed envelope stamped with diplomatic insignia. She opened it calmly. Inside was a copied memo from an ambassador in Europe, describing a suspected secret test by a rival nation. The memo included no proof, only a description of a distant flash seen from a mountain post. Miss Marple read it twice, then smiled sadly. This flash, she said, is likely lightning, or a refinery flare, or a meteor. But by the time this message circulates, it will be transformed into evidence. And then, Sir Roland asked. Then, Miss Marple answered, the world will react to something that never existed. Dr. Park leaned forward. Miss Marple, if all of this began from misinterpretation, then who is responsible? Miss Marple read it twice, then smiled sadly. This flash, she said, is likely lightning, or a refinery flare, or a meteor. But by the time this message circulates, it will be transformed into evidence. And then, Sir Roland asked. Then, Miss Marple answered, the world will react to something that never existed. Dr. Park leaned forward. Miss Marple, if all of this began from misinterpretation, then who is responsible? Miss Marple folded the letter. All of them, which means none of them. She paused, then added, fear creates more authors than facts ever do. As the afternoon deepened, the storm of global panic intensified. Reports of military mobilization, defensive statements, and political speeches flooded the airwaves. But Miss Marple watched something else. She watched patterns. She studied the timelines. Who reacted first? Who reacted second? Who reacted out of pressure rather than intent? It formed a shape, a psychological geometry. Lydia noticed her tracing small circles on the map. What are you seeing? A mirror, Miss Marple whispered. Each nation is copying the fear of the one beside it. And that nation is copying another. No one is leading, they are all following. Dr. Park frowned. You mean, this wasn't a race? Miss Marple shook her head with gentle certainty. No, it was a stampede. A quiet fell over the room. Then Sir Roland asked the question. No one wanted to speak aloud. Can this stampede be stopped? Miss Marple sighed. Stampedes never stop, she said kindly. But they slow when someone stands still long enough for others to see themselves. And who would do that? Lydia whispered. Miss Marple simply looked toward the window, where the evening light softened the world with golden restraint. Night fell quietly that day, in contrast to the turmoil crossing borders. The team gathered outside, sitting among the crates and lanterns. Miss Marple spoke softly, almost to the air. People believe the nuclear age began with a spark. But it began with a shadow, the shadow of what one nation imagined another might do. Lydia hugged her knees. Then is there hope? Miss Marple nodded slowly. Hope rests on understanding what truly happened. Only when people know the origin of their fear can they choose not to repeat it. Sir Roland looked thoughtful. And how would you describe the origin? Miss Marple's eyes shone with calm intelligence. Science revealed fire, she said. But fear decided to run with it. A hush settled over the group. The nuclear age had not begun with a scientist shouting Eureka, but with the world whispering what if. And Miss Marple, listening to the distant hum of radio static and human anxiety, knew the next stage of their investigation would take them deeper, not into laboratories, but into the psychology of nations. And so, as the lanterns flickered, she concluded softly, "Knowledge is fire. Those who carry it must not run." Chapter 11. The Race That Outran Reason. The storm over Geneva had not truly ended. It had only organized itself into quieter layers. Inside the polished conference hall, where delegates argued about security frameworks, Miss Marple stood unnoticed at the edge of a hallway, watching men in expensive coats hurry by with anxiety disguised as importance. She had seen that expression before, in villagers who feared ghosts, in neighbors who feared gossip, in officials who feared the truth. Fear always had the same walk. She turned her attention to the small folder in her hands, the one Lydia Reinhardt had slipped to her before leaving for London. Inside were transcripts of telegrams exchanged between the great powers through the late 1940s. Each message was short, rushed, and alarmingly similar. "We believe that. Others are preparing. We must not fall behind. Investigate at once." Miss Marple paused. It was all so predictable, and so heartbreakingly human. Dr. Selene Park approached softly. "You've seen enough to know the pattern, haven't you?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said, "a pattern older than any nation. Humans copy fear faster than they copy wisdom." Dr. Park nodded. "The diplomats are preparing for another confidential session. They want to discuss the deterrence principle." A principle, Miss Marple mused, which began as a whisper that no one questioned, because everyone feared being second. She closed the folder. A thought had solidified in her mind, sharp and quiet. Fear, not science, began the arms race, and tonight she would prove it. The meeting room was dim and circular, lit only by tall lamps that cast shadows like long fingers pointing to the center table. Delegates sat stiffly, their faces too tired to hide their calculations. Miss Marple stood discreetly behind Sir Roland Keene, who had reluctantly agreed to let her observe. "As long as you remain silent," he had whispered. She never promised silence, she simply smiled. A diplomat from the United States spoke first. "We believed we had no choice. Intelligence reports suggested the Soviets were months away." Immediately a Soviet representative countered. "We accelerated only because we were told you had begun a second-generation project." "No," replied the American. "We heard you had tested a new device in secret." Miss Marple interjected gently, her voice soft but unmistakably firm. "And who told each of you that the others were ahead?" The room froze. Sir Roland shut his eyes. "Here we go," his posture seemed to say. The Soviet diplomat frowned. Our analysts, of course, and yours. Miss Marple asked the American. Our intelligence officers, he replied. She nodded slowly. Yes, analysts reading fear. Officers reading rumors. Each of you running, because you were told someone else was running. A silence deeper than embarrassment filled the room. Dr. Park stepped beside her. She's right, she said. Your archives show no proof the other side was advancing, only fear of what they might be doing. Miss Marple added softly, you raced against shadows. And shadows always win. They run faster than truth. No one spoke. No one needed to. When the session recessed, Miss Marple walked alone along the marble corridor. A tall window overlooked the city, Lake Geneva shimmering like a calm sheet of glass hiding centuries of conflict beneath. Sir Roland joined her, exhaling heavily. They weren't ready to hear that. No, she said. But truth rarely waits for readiness. It simply appears. What now? Now, Miss Marple replied. We show them where the fire began, not in laboratories, but in the frightened hearts of men who believed they were being watched. Roland frowned. You have evidence. I have something better, she said. A pattern. She handed him 2 telegram copies. Look at the dates. Both nations believed the other had made a breakthrough on the same week. Impossible unless they shared the same rumor. Roland's eyes widened. Someone fed both sides the same lie. Miss Marple shook her head. Not a lie, a misinterpretation. A scientist requesting additional power for experiments was mistaken for building a larger device. A simple bureaucratic jump. Fear fills gaps faster than facts can. Roland stared out the window. We nearly destroyed civilization because of a misunderstood request. Oh, Sir Roland, she said gently. Civilizations have collapsed over far smaller misunderstandings. Night settled over the city like a velvet curtain pulled gently across the world. Miss Marple and Dr. Park met Lydia in a small cafe overlooking the river. Candlelight flickered between them. Lydia leaned forward. So the beginning of the nuclear age wasn't a plan. No, Miss Marple replied. It was a reaction, Dr. Park added. Fear became policy. Policy became rivalry. Rivalry became production. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her manner calm as ever. You see, my dears, the great powers didn't choose the race. They stumbled into it, each convinced the other had already begun. Lydia shook her head slowly. Then everything built afterward. Treaties, stockpiles, threats. All because of a misread intention. Yes, Miss Marple said. Because no one paused long enough to ask the simplest question. Is this true? The cafe door opened briefly. Cold air entered. Then quiet restored itself. Dr. Park said softly, then your conclusion changes everything. It means the nuclear age began not with genius, but with fear. Miss Marple smiled, sad and wise. Fear is the world's fastest teacher. It writes history before reason holds the pen. Later that night, Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, the same one she carried from village wells to ancient caves to modern conferences. Nations do not rush toward danger because they are wicked. They rush because they believe others already have. Fear travels faster than science, faster than truth, faster than fire. And so the world's greatest flames were lit not by hatred, but by hurried imagination. She closed the notebook with care. Knowledge, she whispered to the darkened room, is fire. Those who carry it must not run. The city outside slept under a fragile peace, unaware that an elderly woman had just uncovered the most human secret of the nuclear age. Chapter 12. The Final Lesson of Fire. Miss Marple stood alone inside the dimly lit conference hall, watching the enormous world map glowing on the wall. Red dots marked every nuclear test site since the 1940s. Blue dots marked the ones done in secret. Yellow indicated the ones denied or erased from records. She felt the weight of it, not as fear, but as a quiet ache for the world's abandoned wisdom. A soft voice broke the silence. Dr. Eleanor Wright approached, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You said you wished to see me once more before leaving London," she said. "I assumed tea would be required." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Tea's always required when truth feels too large for only one mind." They sat by the window overlooking the Thames. Fog curled over the water like smoke remembering its shape, the events of the past weeks, the archives, the letters, the confessions, the hidden agreements, the frantic scientists who feared rivals more than knowledge, all weighed in the air around them. "Eleanor," Miss Marple said softly, "you've spent your life studying nuclear science. Tell me something plainly. Was the world ever ready for this power?" Dr. Wright hesitated, then shook her head. "No, the science outran the ethics. We had a matchstick before we learned how to breathe gently." Miss Marple nodded. "Then we must remind them." Hours later, the small meeting room filled with diplomats, physicists, historians, and government officials, the same people who had, intentionally or not, shaped the age of nuclear fire. Miss Marple stood at the far end of the long wooden table, small, calm, utterly unafraid. They had called her a consultant. She felt more like a mirror. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I thank you for allowing an elderly woman with no scientific credentials to address you. But perhaps I bring something you have misplaced, perspective." She paced slowly, hands clasped gently behind her back. "Your archives showed me something troubling. Fear traveled faster than science. Competition replaced caution. Pride replaced patience. Nations hurried not because they understood nuclear power, but because they understood rivalry." The room shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple continued, voice soft but precise. "The first nuclear experiments were driven by panic, then ambition, then ego, and finally, momentum. No one stopped to ask the oldest question of human civilization: should we?" She pointed to the wall map. "Here is every place the earth was forced to swallow fire. Each marked spot is not a triumph, but a warning." A diplomat spoke. "Miss Marple, with respect, what do you expect us to do?" "We cannot undo the nuclear age." "No," she said. "But you may still decide what kind of age it becomes next." She leaned over the table. "You have built a world where a mistake can erase a continent. That is astonishing power. But power without wisdom," she paused, "is fire carried by children." The room went silent. After the meeting, several officials argued in hushed tones. Some protested transparency. Others insisted on revisiting old agreements. Dr. Wright watched with frustration. But Miss Marple simply observed them with her usual patient curiosity. When the group finally dispersed, Eleanor approached her. "I don't know if your words changed anything," she admitted. "Oh, but they did," Miss Marple replied. "They changed one thing: the silence. Silence is where irresponsibility grows." Eleanor exhaled. "You think speaking it aloud is enough?" "No," Miss Marple said gently, "but it is a beginning. And all safety, like all danger, begins with beginnings." They walked together along the river bank. London's lamps glowed gold on the water. Miss Marple paused at the railing, the wind lifting the edge of her coat. "There is something I've realized," she said quietly. "The nuclear age wasn't created by geniuses. It was created by frightened men. and the more frightened they became, the more they thought themselves wise. Eleanor frowned. Then who will lead us toward real wisdom? Miss Marple smiled. Those who fear their own power more than their neighbors. That night, she returned to her small town house in St. Mary Mead. Her room smelled faintly of lavender. The world outside was quiet again. No laboratories, no archives, no urgent telegrams. Just home, she set her notebook on the desk and wrote her final reflection. Knowledge is fire. Those who carry it must not run. She closed the book. But she did not close the question. In the garden, the moon shone over the old rose bushes. Miss Marple walked slowly along the path, her footsteps soft on the gravel. She paused beside the bird bath where the water reflected the sky. Humanity always learns its lessons late, she whispered. But it does learn. She dipped her fingers into the cool water. Ripples spread outward, slow, gentle, steady. Wisdom, she said softly, travels like this. Not like explosions, but like circles widening. For the first time in weeks, she felt peace. She looked up at the moon, its pale light touching the earth with quiet generosity. And she whispered, as though speaking to the world itself, let the next stage be quieter than the last. The garden stayed still, as if listening. A soft wind passed through the roses, not fire, not fear, but only breath. Miss Marple smiled, turning back toward her house. A new age awaited, one she hoped would finally remember that power must move with grace, not speed. And with that thought, she closed the door behind her.